All right, can everyone see it? So Christina and I actually have been having this conversation about just land acknowledgements in general, and the fact that everything that we do in this work in our committee has to do with land, the zoning and the decisions on it. And so this is a land acknowledgement that I use with my day job, Green Latinos, really trying to acknowledge the fact that there are so many people that lived here, and we know, including my ancestors, the Hickory, Apache, and the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute Nations definitely called Colorado home. It's more than just saying it. It's about recognizing it. And groups like Historic Denver, the City and County of Denver, the Colorado History Colorado Museum, they're all making huge steps to try to tell more of the story. And so we just want to encourage you to learn more about the contemporary peoples. It's not just about the past, it's about the future and the present. And we also wanted to take a minute to acknowledge Katie Fisher, whom sadly passed away. Actually, Katie was one of the first people that I ever met in the Parks Board when I was like 22 years old. And she was always a smile on her face, very dedicated, and was a ZAP committee member for as long as I can remember. And we just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge her and let the community know. She actually spoke not that long ago at our last meeting, just days before she passed. And so we just wanted to acknowledge her. Go ahead, Drew.
Sorry. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Drew Dutcher. I am the new president of INC since September. And I just wanted to sort of put a shout out there. We have some changes on the board, and Christine O'Connor and Ean Tafoya have done a fantastic job co-chairing this zoning and planning committee. But I think they're people are a little overwhelmed, and we are looking for co-chairs of some of our committees in INC, including zoning and planning. Excuse me. And so if there's anyone in the meeting that might have some interest in that, this is sort of a discussion that goes on, and we need to find a very good fit, somebody that could fill these shoes. Please email president@denverinc.org. I'll put that in the chat, but that was just a shout out to anyone that might be interested in co-chairing zoning and planning. We also need co-chairs for parks and also climate and sustainability. So I know you're all active civic-minded people, and you may want to extend your participation in this way. So please, I'll put my email in the chat and reach out if you have any interest at all, and we'll begin a discussion. Thanks very much, Ian. That's all I had to say.
Thanks, Drew. We appreciate it. And I'll pass it to you, Christine. We've been asking, we asked Drew to come here and ask. I've been the chair for 5 years now, and just with my campaign and things, it's been a little busy for me. And I think, Christine, I don't know if you'll ever really retire, but you keep talking about what real retirement would be like. And so we're really hoping that we can find some people who'd want to come on and work with us for a couple months and help you get an understanding and make the connections to the city partners that we've really developed over this administration.
That would be wonderful. So let Drew know, and send him an email, and he can talk with you about your involvement. Okay, so let's get to the first item. We have Councilwoman Sandoval, and I think I see her aide, Melissa Horn, and we have Brad Johnson from CPD, who are going to talk about, Councilwoman Sandoval is going to present a couple of overlays that are almost ready to go to planning on the west side and Sunnyside that have been in progress for some while. So Councilwoman Sandoval, it's all yours.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Ian and Christine, and thank you for your service to INC ZAP. These community meetings are really important, and especially to your point, Ian, when it involves land use. So I'm Councilwoman Amanda Sandoval, who represents Northwest Denver in District 1. I have my council aide, Melissa Horn, here with me, and Brad and I have been working on this project the entire time I've been in council, and prior to that, this work actually started under Councilman Espinosa, and we've been refining it. And I would just like to call out, we have a couple people from Sunnyside who we've been working closely with. We have Bill Hare on the call, and we have Kevin Anderson, and both of them have been integral to the work that we've been doing. So I'm going to share my screen. Don't make fun of all the tabs that I have open, because this is how I think. So we're talking about two different residential conservation overlays in the Sunnyside neighborhood. So in the PowerPoint presentation, we'll go over the overlay facts, why it's important, the background of it, the elements over the overlay, within the overlay, and we'll do question and answer. And question and answers, that's why CPD is here to help get some of the technical questions answered. I used to have an in-house planner named Naomi, and she got a little bit planning fatigue through COVID. And so she left my office, unfortunately, and is doing other things, and it's greatly missed. So I'm gonna have to have Brad help me with some of the more technical issues if they come up. So within the Denver zoning code, we have the opportunity to create a conservation overlay, and the conservation overlay is a vehicle to initiate and implement zoning, and with the conservation, with the idea of conserving specific areas within a certain geographic area. So the criteria for approval is distinctive building features, period of construction, style, size, scale, detailing, mass, color, materials. So these are all key elements of what we had at the foundation of all the work that we were doing within Sunnyside on these two overlays. So as you all probably know how a conservation overlay, you have your base zoning, and then you can overlay on top of the base zoning to make modifications to the underlying zone districts. And one key thing on this one is this last bullet point. You can't modify uses. So it's not a use overlay. It's just so you can still build single unit dwelling. You'll still be able to have single family 2 unit. So it doesn't modify any uses. It just modifies the like the regulations, the bulk and the mass. So within the Denver zoning code, you have 2 overlays. You have several overlays in here. One of the first ones I got to work on was the Potter Highland CO4. That's where I first started learning about overlays, and that was under Councilwoman Montero, which a lot of this work comes from there. And then my office was able to pass, with the assistance of Brad again, and my office and people in the Harkness Heights area, we passed the bungalow conservation overlay, CO6, and a lot of our elements stem from the Potter Highland conservation overlay mixed with the bungalow overlay, and now here we are with 2 ones for Sunnyside. So just wanted to tell you that this work is based in a lot of work that's already passed within the Denver zoning code. Oh, why is my, hold on, sorry. It's not letting me advance. Okay, so here's the Sunnyside neighborhood. We have Sunnyside from Federal, Inca, I-70 to 38th. And for the overlay, we have single unit, we have SUC, SUC1, and 2 units. So here's all of so those are the zone districts that the overlay will be applied to, single unit and 2 unit. So here's some of the concerns that we've had in Northwest Denver is that as redevelopment has occurred, the scale and massing is out of character and does not match the built environment. And the relationship to the street is not very good, and there's issues with privacy. So some of the history of how this started was with my predecessor, Councilman Espinosa. We started having conversations with the Sunnyside community. And then in 2019, they brought the proposal forward to CPD. And then I was elected and sworn in July. And I took the work off from there. And then in 2020, when COVID hit, we were making progress. We had a task force and we started meeting virtually so that we could keep working through this. And my staff, Naomi, figured out how to do online surveying so that even though we were living in a virtual world, we were still able to make sure that we were able to move forward with the work that we were doing. We went to planning board for an informational item in June, and now we're here because we have the formal public comment, which just went out yesterday. So it's open for public comment, and once the public comment will be open for 30 days, and then we'll be able to go to planning board once we receive public comment and go over what was received from the residents. So who we are, I'm Councilwoman Sandoval, my staff Melissa, my Naomi worked diligently on this, so I have to make sure to give her a shout out. We have Kevin Anderson, who's an architect and a Sunnyside resident. James, who's the co-chair of the Sunnyside Planning Community Development, also Sunnyside resident. Bill Hare, who's also part of the Sunnyside Planning Community Development, and he's a small business owner. Rod Kaczynski, he's an architect and Sunnyside resident. Trupti, who I think some of you are very familiar with. She's the president of Sunnyside and lives in the neighborhood as well. And then Brad Johnson. And I just have to get a shout out to Catherine Cornwell. She was essential in making this, and she did a lot of the heavy lifting in the very beginning and set the foundation for us, and many others along the way. So how did I do outreach? We created a project website. We created a survey. We mailed the one at the very bottom is my office mailed all the property owners who would be impacted through US mail. And then once we went through US mail, we followed up with flyers. We hosted 2 town halls. We put posters and yard signs so that we could gather feedback throughout the entire community. So what we did is this slide right here was something we kept going back. The community gave us the proposal. We came through group consensus. We did modeling and testing. We worked with CPD. We went through and we refined it. And this kept happening over the last 2.5, 3 years. So what is the point of the overlays? Why do we want the overlays, and why is the community asking for us to work on this? Some key elements are to ensure development is compatible and in scale, because oftentimes as redevelopment's occurring, the massing is out of context. We want to make sure that we still provide flexibility within the zoning code. We want to have a higher level of pattern in Sunnyside to keep within the built environment. That's why we're using a conservation overlay. We want to make sure that our side setbacks are prevailing, and we want to make sure that we have a strong relationship between the street and the built environment, our homes. So there's several elements of the overlay. One is to reduce the bulk plane. 2 is limit low slope roofs, which AKA they're called flat roofs, but their technical term is called low slope roof. Allow dormers, require a porch, and we're going to have above ground gross floor area cap. And then within part of the overlay, we'll have a brick requirement. That's why we have conservation overlay 7 that has all of the design elements that we just mentioned here. And one of the conservation overlay 8 will only require brick in certain parts of Sunnyside when it's the prevailing material. So what do I say? What does it mean when I say reduce bulk plane? So here's the bulk plane within here. And what we're doing is we're going to reduce the bulk plane so that we can have better conforming structures and that look like other structures within, because when we updated the zoning code in 2010, it allowed more mass and bulk, and it feels out of character. And people have in Sunnyside have been wanting to have the massing reduced. So that's one of the design elements. The next is limit the low slope roof, which are flat roofs, because a lot of times what we're doing is we're seeing wedding layer cakes in Sunnyside, the 3, and people aren't liking that. So we would like to incentivize pitched roofs and not decentivize low slope roofs, AKA flat roofs. We're adding the addition of dormers so that as a family grows, you can pop the top and you can stay within your home. And it's a simple, easy way. They've been allowed for a long time. So that was one of the first things that we did in 2015 with the Potter Highland overlay, is the addition of allowing dormers. We also did that in the bungalow overlay, and now we're also doing it here, so that you don't want to incentivize scrapes. You want to make sure that you're actually incentivizing people staying within their homes. So here's one that has been talked about a lot. We worked on this in the bungalow overlay in Harkness Heights neighborhood. Is this idea of requiring porches. So as redevelopment has occurred in Sunnyside, porches are going away, and porches keep community, they keep eyes on the street. They're a key feature of homes. So we've worked on this and refined the porch requirement numerous times over the years. We actually went to planning board in June and we took feedback depth, and what we think this will just make sure that you have a place to sit on your front porch and be able to keep eyes on the street. And it's a key design element and key feature within the Sunnyside neighborhood. And here's the idea of above ground gross floor area cap. So here, as redevelopment has occurred in Sunnyside, so the market drives all of the pricing, as we know, in Denver. And so the average size of homes in Northwest Denver and Sunnyside, we did this whole, if you see over here, what are the home sizes over the decades? And so you can see that this in the 1920s to 29, it was the average was 994, and they've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So our thought is, as gentrification and has occurred, as gentrification and displacement has occurred, what we can do is limit the amount of gross floor area on not the basement, so that we can use this overlay as a displacement and anti-gentrification tool. And here's one of the last elements is the brick. So this map that you're seeing here is a map from the assessor's office. And so from the assessor's office, you can see the green are brick, and then this purple area is frame. So you see a pattern throughout Sunnyside where this area within the red is predominantly brick, and this area outside is frame construction. And so that is this area within the main green is the conservation overlay 8, which would require brick, and it's broken up to 60% of the brick would be the street facing to help with the relationship between the street and a home, and then 40% on the interior walls, so on the side of each house. And then there's no requirement for the rear facing. And so this is, we just pulled this, we pulled the information from the assessor's office, and this was just pulled a couple months ago. So this is just fresh data. So here is the areas that would have the conservation overlay 7 that has all of the design elements. Here's the conservation overlay 8. So once again, we're reducing the bulk plane. We're incentivizing pitched roofs over flat roofs. We're allowing dormers. We're requiring porches. We have a above ground floor growth cap. And then here within this area is the area that would require brick. And these areas that are not within the red, that are outliers, that's because they're not TU zoning or SU zoning. They're mixed use or open space. And that's all the presentation. So with that, I can stop sharing my screen and we can have questions and answers.
Councilwoman, before you take the screen away,
Yep.
I'm just wondering if you could go back. I didn't get the gross floor area issue. I just don't get it. So if you could go back to that.
Yep. Brad, do you want to help answer with this one?
Happy to. So by gross floor area, what we mean essentially is the total square footage of the building, of all the floors of a building combined. And that's how we use gross floor area for commercial buildings and so on and so forth. And so what this rule is doing is based on Councilwoman's team's analysis of the kind of prevailing square footages for primary structures in the neighborhood, coming up with a 3,000 square foot max for gross floor area. However, a key element is that exempted from that maximum is anything that's below ground, like a basement space. And so if I have a 2-story house with a basement's not a part of the calculation, but my first story and my second story could not exceed 3,000 square feet. And that rule is only meant to apply to urban house, meaning like a single unit home. And a duplex would not have to follow that requirement per the
Okay. Are all the lots 7,500?
No, so what that does is most of them are well below 7,500, I would suspect, and 7,500 is pretty big, right? Especially for that neighborhood. So what it's saying is that it's 3,000 max for anything below 7,500, but once you start to go above 7,500, because there are some big lots in there mixed around the neighborhood, and so to give a little bit more flexibility to somebody with a bigger lot, there's a kind of proportional increase in the amount of square footage allowed above 3,000 for those larger lots.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to go to Miles, who has his hand up, and anybody else who wants to ask questions, raise your hand.
Well, thank you, Councilwoman. That looks like a really good assessment, analysis, and looking at what you're trying to achieve by doing a detailed analysis of a neighborhood. I think it's wonderful, and I think the city should be more following, or the planning department should be following your lead. I see a lot of, they want to just do citywide things, and like with ADU, and I know the planning department will be pushing, because it's in Blueprint Denver, being able to put multifamily on all single family lots. And I don't think there's any analysis or looking at what the potential impacts would be to the neighborhoods, and the different neighborhoods, each one's different. So let me ask you, I think this is wonderful, and I think they should be doing this for all parts of the city. And when planning changes or zoning changes are being done, they need to be looking at the character of that neighborhood and actually do outreach to that neighborhood to get feedback. So let me ask you this. How do you feel about, or how would the ADU, the new rules impact your overlay? And then again, going back to what the planning department will be pushing in the future to allow duplex, triplex, and quadplex on all single family lots. How would that impact? How would your overlay impact? Would that ADU override it all? The changes that the city wants to make?
So Brad, I could attempt to answer the first part, but the second part, I think that would be more suited for you. Is that okay? So the ADU questions, most of Sunnyside, and I see Lou, you had the same question. Most of Sunnyside has accessory dwelling unit allowed. There's just a very small portion. Right now, this neighborhood's going through the neighborhood planning initiative. And so when that moves forward and advances a small area plan, my goal would be to rezone the portions that do not allow accessory dwelling units and advance that type of zoning. I've done that for neighborhoods. I've done Chaffee Park, Regis, Sloan's Lake, and I'm almost to final public hearing for West Highland to allow accessory dwelling units. So the accessory dwelling units, I don't think impact anything with this overlay. The accessory dwelling units would be allowed. And once the city comes forward with recommendations from the accessory dwelling unit task force, they would be implemented and have no impact on this overlay. And this overlay has no impact on the accessory dwelling units. Now, the second part of your question about having single family and having duplexes allowed on single family, I'm going to pass that over to Brad because that's a bigger question that I think CPD is working on right now.
Yeah, so I think you said it pretty well, Miles, that Blueprint Denver recommends that the city think collectively citywide about in an exploration and project about what it would mean and what factors would need to be considered for increasing residential density. And don't quote me on this, but I'm trying to paraphrase, I guess, the policy, but it's pretty much as you said, right? Exploring the potential for adding additional residential density into existing single unit areas and areas with single unit zoning and all of that. And we just haven't even started that project yet, right? And so all I can really speak to at this point is the policy, which you're very well aware of because you described it probably better than me. But you know, when we get to that project, first of all, I think urban design and relationship of built environment, whatever the number of units is going to be a huge deal because the way that these buildings are designed is going to have a big factor on how they fit in a neighborhood, how they feel and how compatible they are and what their impacts are on an existing area and so on. And so I think that regardless of what overlays are in place or anything like that, or even historic districts, we're going to be looking at that whenever that project happens as a very citywide approach. And I don't think there would be any expectation that we wouldn't also look at any area covered by a conservation overlay. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to try to tell the future, but I guess a conceivable outcome under a project like that could be to change rules associated with an overlay. We'll just have to see, you know, when we get there.
Yeah, no, I guess my question then is the goal, and I think you've achieved it, is a scale issue. And this is for a single family home. So the question then is if CPD goes, oh, we want to allow quadplexes. So then would CPD say, okay, so let's just multiply that bulk by 4 because it's a fourplex. So they can override the overlay, I guess, is my question. Or does the overlay create the envelope for the lot if it's single or triplex or a duplex or triplex? Do you understand the question?
Right. Yeah, right now this overlay applies to areas with single unit and 2 unit zoning only.
Okay.
And so that's how it's going to work right now, right? In the near term. What's going to happen someday, pending a policy discussion and all kinds of other discussions citywide about allowing a triplex potentially in these areas that currently only allow single unit and 2 unit buildings and properties, I just don't know. And I know that's not that satisfying, but until we have those discussions as a city, I just can't predict the future of where that's going to go. I would doubt that it would be something as crude as just multiply by 4, but I guess it's conceivable.
So quick question, follow up for Councilwoman. So now the city's planning on changing ADU rules. So for some of the lots that you've seen in your neighborhood, they were talking about increasing the size of the ADUs to like 1,000 square feet. And I said, that's the size of my Denver's, that's the footprint of my Denver Square. So how do you think that would impact some of those houses if they were to put a 1,000 square foot ADU or allow them in the Sunnyside area? Does that change the bulk and the scale if it's much bigger than the original house? Just wondering.
So from what I understand, an accessory dwelling unit is always and should be accessory to the primary. So I don't think that our rules are going to circumvent that rule, that a accessory dwelling unit should be accessory to the primary. And so I think that we're going to look at lot sizes, and in certain lot sizes that are bigger, I think it makes sense to have a bigger one, but it's
Right.
always going to be predetermined on your lot size. And so I think the average lot size in Sunnyside that we're looking at is between 3,000 and 5,000. And so that's still going to have a modest, smaller accessory dwelling unit, even if these proposals from the ADU task force advance. But Naomi from my office is a task force member from there, and so we're because accessory dwelling units are really key, I think, to the missing middle housing that we lack in Denver, and that's why I've been rezoning neighborhoods to allow them. But we'll have to have that conversation as it advances. As somebody who will vote on that policy and those changes, it's going to be important that we hear from community, but I don't think that those will have a great impact on this overlay or in these neighborhoods. I think that they will still be very gentle density.
Thank you. Thank you. My concern is you have a single story main house and then somebody builds a 2-story ADU, and then at some future point, if the planning department says you can split lots, that you start breaking them up into separate residences, and it just, I don't know what it would look like. That's all. But thank you for your hard work. It's good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Tom Mobley.
Good morning. Good to see Brad and Amanda. And I do miss Naomi. So in absentia, I'll say hello to her. I was involved with Brad and Amanda and Naomi on the development of the Harkness Heights overlay, which is called the bungalow overlay, which was approved by council a year and a half ago. And I think we started that 4 or 5 years before. So it's a long process. It was a long process. And there is no way in the world that we would have ever accomplished it without Amanda, Naomi, and Brad and that full team. They were the keys to us getting it done, plus a very engaged neighborhood. So thank you to them. I observed Sunnyside's efforts during our process. They were somewhat in parallel. And congratulations to Sunnyside for getting this done. Sunnyside is a much larger and diverse architecturally neighborhood than us. And I was saying they were going to have some challenges, but they were able to pull it off. So congratulations. Which leads me to my first question. Then I have a second question, which gets into the weeds a bit. The first question is, if you notice, these overlays are predominantly, if not all, in District 1. Crisana Park is one of the more recent ones that was not in District 1. And this may go back to Brad and possibly Amanda. Are other neighborhoods and other districts actively working on overlays at this time?
I can answer part of that question. Some of my colleagues have, so I worked on a design overlay for Tennyson, active centers and corridors, and it's a design overlay. And so we have it on Tennyson, we mapped it, and my colleagues are working on Santa Fe, and they're working on East Colfax with that overlay. And some of my colleagues have come to me with interest on this overlay because as gentrification and displacement has happened throughout Denver, they would be excited to use this overlay. But one of the things, Tom, that's unique to Northwest Denver is, I use this term often, is it's some of Denver's original neighborhoods, like Highland. It actually was its own town before Denver. And so I think that we could apply some of these elements of the overlay throughout other parts of Denver. And once it gets established, I bet that would start happening. I don't know of any that are working on it right now. I think they're waiting for me to be the pioneer, similar to the accessory dwelling units that I bring forward of rezoning neighborhoods. They like me to be the pioneer and see how it goes.
We do have Tom, and Tom, awesome to hear your voice again. It's been a while. We do have the overlays that Councilwoman just described were more of a commercial nature, right? Like, so we're talking about a Tennyson context or a Santa Fe. Is that Santa Fe Avenue Boulevard? I'm sorry, I can't remember, but Santa Fe.
Santa Fe
corridor.
Drive.
Santa Fe Drive, thank
Yeah.
you. Got to get that from a local. She knew that, of course. So those are more of a commercial nature. We only have one that I can think of, Tom, that's more of a context like more similar to a Sunnyside or a Harkness Heights, which is South City Park. So the blocks just immediately below City Park are kind of coming together and they're talking about it. They're not in any formal application stage or anything right now, but they're really looking to the bungalow and the Sunnyside overlays as models. The eastern part of that neighborhood, in fact, is quite similar to Harkness Heights in its scale and forms. And so we'll see if that one goes. But what we see is that it's really important. It's really difficult because neighborhoods really have to come together and do a ton of work to make this happen and get buy-in and kind of, get it to the right place that people are supportive of. And it takes a very a dedicated and active council member to support those efforts as well. So
I'm glad to hear you mentioned South City Park. They approached me within 6 months after our overlay being approved, and I did a call with their planning group, and they were so all over the place and so, I hate to use the term, but that's the best one, loosey-goosey. I wasn't sure if they were ever going to be able to organize it. And everybody I've talked to about the process, you've got to have an engaged community who's willing to put in the work. You can't turn it all over to you. You did a tremendous amount of work, or Naomi, but the neighborhood has to go out and pound the pavement and get this done. There's no question about it. I have a second question. It's really getting into the weeds for Brad and possibly Amanda. I was intrigued to see that you went forward with the porch like we did, which is so important to our neighborhood. Porches are critical to us, and we put it in the overlay. And we had a tremendous amount of pushback from the planning board. And I was intrigued to hear that the planning board went through this, and you broke up a bit on that part, Amanda. Did they give any kind of pushback, or did we break enough ground to get porches to be acceptable, particularly to Aisha?
So when we were at planning board in June, I would still say it was pretty hot topic. If you agree, Brad, it was discussed thoroughly, and there was a big discussion between what is a stoop and what is a porch. And through that, we actually did refine the requirements of it. So the process has moved forward. One thing, Tom, that I think besides the porch in the bungalow overlay, remind me the element it's called, Brad. You have to raise so that you the ground floor, above the ground floor, that became controversial, and we pulled that design element out of this overlay so that you don't have that. So you could actually have a porch meet you at the sidewalk, where that's not what is in the bungalow overlay, if that's correct, Brad.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay.
I've forgotten about.
Yes, we took that design element, Tom, out, which made the porch seem not as big of an issue, but when you added both of those issues together, but that is a major design element in Harkness Heights, is the Denver Hill.
I forgot about that being such a painful discussion with the planning board. So in one sense, I think it's a shame that you all had to pull out of Sunnyside because it was such a key issue to us, but the Denver Hill did almost mandate that for us.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, thank you. We're almost done here, but I don't know if Bill Tanner wants to chime in. He's made a couple of useful comments, and I see Drew has his hand up. Are you talking about the same thing, Drew, or should we go to Bill Tanner on overlays?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of comment that currently the Elyria neighborhood is going for historic and cultural designation with historic Denver. And I think that's kind of another level of the design, above the design overlay. But I think it's in response to many of the concerns that people have in Sunnyside. What happens when there's just development that just does not respect the context or is way out of scale. So I think that this is, I'm glad to see this overlay happening. But I'm also a little troubled by the response from the city to Myle Tanglin's question about there's a possibility one day we'll just get rid of zoning altogether and just upzone everything. And, there's a lot going on here. We just have decisions to make as a city. There's pressure to increase density and make neighborhoods sustainable, but then we do have sort of these low-lying suburbs that are the low density. So these are decisions that I think you've got to include the public on. And that's, I guess I'll just end there. I just sort of wanted to compare, historic designation versus an overlay.
Yeah, the neighborhoods Harkness Heights, where Tom lives, Drew, and Sunnyside weren't interested in the historic because it's different, right? Demolition is not allowed. You have a year of significance, and it's just much more, a lot more different type of requirements. Even to get a roof replaced, you have to go through Landmark LPC to Landmark Planning Commission to get roofs replaced. So this is just to help with, I might be out of turn here, but I think most of us have heard this term fugly and the Denver ugly page. And so as redevelopment has occurred, that's what we are trying to address here with our overlays. And one of the things as a councilwoman born and raised in Northwest Denver, where displacement and gentrification has occurred, how can I use zoning as a tool to help slow that down just a little bit more? And if you can deal with the mass and scaling is what Kevin Anderson kept talking about. He's an architect who's on our planning team. He mentions massing and scaling all the time, and it just helps with that built environment in Northwest Denver. So that's why we're not going for a historic district, but I am working in West Colfax with the Orthodox Jewish community on a cultural historic district, which is much smaller. It's only 300. The proposal would be 300 doors, where this is all of the Sunnyside SU and TU zoning, which is about 3,000 doors. So much different. And I don't know of a historic district that's 3,000 doors. That's pretty big.
That's very helpful, Amanda. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that thoughtful question.
Bill, unless you want to speak up, I think we should wrap this issue up.
I'll just, I can say a couple of things, very briefly. Yeah, we're looking at an overlay. And on the residential side, we're also looking at requirement for porches because we believe, as Amanda already pointed out, that puts eyes on the street and also improves neighborhood interaction, which is key to building a cohesive neighborhood. Our neighborhood is split into two parts, residential, which is actually multifamily in Cherry Creek East. It's, allows for row houses and townhouses. I live in a townhouse myself, for example. And we have a high density side of the neighborhood, which is where there is development up to 12 stories. And in the residential side, we're just working on improving neighborhood cohesiveness and also trying to make sure that the neighborhood retains its walkability and fits in with some of the other parameters that Denver has said are important for future development, i.e. That we have trees, You know, the right kind of landscaping, although I see that shifting into xeriscaping at some point in the future. But on the commercial side, all we're really looking for there is that we don't wind up with a downtown type environment where buildings rise straight up from the street with no break in the building front and no concession made for public spaces where people can congregate and where the sunlight can get through to the street, which is a characteristic, as you all know, that's important to Denver. So that's what we're working on, and it is a battle. You know, I think people have already commented on the city's desire for higher density and the need for more housing. I think the issue is, you know, to balance that need for density with the need for maintaining and improving livability in a lot of neighborhoods, so that it's, you know, so that we don't lose some of the desirable aspects of Denver at the time that we increase density. That's all I have to say. Thank you. Unless anybody has any questions.
Miles, unless it's really important, I kind of want to move on to thank the councilwoman and move on, but is this short?
Yeah, just a quick thing. And Michael Henry raised his hand too. So Councilwoman, just be aware, you were looking at the square footage size and that has changed. But the other thing that's changed demographically has been you have people living all by themselves in a whole house. So when I hear this, oh, we've got to increase density, you have more single people living in a lot of square footage on their own. So we've got to increase density. I don't know if that is something that's really tangible because people live in more and more space. That's all. That's my only comment.
I just said add gentle density through accessory dwelling units. It's a different type of housing stock.
Okay, Michael Henry, got the last comment if you unmute.
You have to unmute, Michael. We can't hear you. Have to go to your little microphone at the bottom left.
I beg your pardon. I want to remind everybody that INC the last couple weeks hosted some ballot issue forums, and we're now, and Drew knows this, and Greg Sorensen helped a great deal. We're now gearing up for forums for the city election. And the city election, as everybody should be aware, is coming up in April. And a lot of the issues that you've been talking about this morning are going to depend a lot on who is elected to be mayor and to city council. And I'm hoping that all of INC can start thinking about ideas and beliefs that we'd like to present to all the candidates and make sure that we have a role, particularly about land use planning.
Thank you, Michael. That's very important.
Very important. Couldn't agree more.
So I would like to thank Amanda, Melissa, and Brad, and the Kevin and the other resident, Bill Hare from Sunnyside.
Yep.
For attending today. Your overlay is really impressive, as several people have said, and it seems that everything you're doing is really kind of standing up to some of the pressure on the other side, and it's really done well. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. And thank you for making room on your agenda. And just shout out to Brad again. Thank you so much, Brad, for shepherding through this process. I know it's kind of at the beginning of the end. And thank you, Bill and Kevin, and Melissa, thank you so much for your work getting this presentation together. It takes a team, right? It's my name on it as the applicant, but I sure would not be able to be here without tons of community members. So thank you all, and thank you for your advocacy and all the work you do. And I look forward to seeing you at another time. Have a great weekend.
Okay, well, while they cycle off, we'll let Brad take over the presentation on the next issue. I'll just introduce it by saying that we all know that during COVID, restaurants became a lot more active on the sidewalk and the street. And those were some emergency interim regs that have been extended. And now the city is talking about how to tweak that to make some of it permanent. So Brad, would you like to talk about the shared places program that you're working on?
Absolutely. I appreciate that introduction. So I took a hat off and now I'm putting a different hat on. So just to reintroduce, my name is Brad Johnson. I'm a principal city planner with CPD. I'm an urban designer and participate on our urban design team at CPD. And so let me show you guys some pictures so you don't have to just look at me. Let's see. Just tell me if this is showing up okay. Are y'all seeing that? Sorry, I can't
Yeah.
see you. If you're
Yes.
okay.
Yes. Yes.
Cool. All right. So what I'm here to talk to you about today is what we have coined the Denver Outdoor Places program. And as Christine said, what this really is a permanent program to allow removable and outdoor patios, which builds off of some of the successes and good things we saw during the COVID emergency patio program over the last couple of years, but also tries to learn from some of the negative impacts that we saw as part of that program as well. And so I'll try to walk through some of the basically an overview of this effort as a whole, but also we'll give some focus on one type of patio that we're really working hard on right now. And so yes, this whole story kind of starts with COVID and the capacity limits for indoor dining that were put in place that resulted in the city coming together and providing regulatory relief both on private property, but also within the right of way to allow dining to occur outside so that we could help our businesses survive unpredictable pandemic that came along and had huge impacts on that sector and many others, as you know. And just would say that in setting up this temporary program, which we called the Temporary Outdoor Expansion Program, it was an emergency program. But for little patios that you might not think are that complicated, they have a lot of impacts on a lot of different things. So to set up this temporary program, and this still holds true as we look at building up a permanent program, many different issues arise when you think about the impacts of patios. And so many different departments had to come together to work on the temporary program and as we set up that permanent program. So I work for CPD, but I'm just one of the many departments involved. We also have Department of Transportation and Infrastructure. We have the Department of Economic Development and Opportunity, DEDO. We have excise and license, because when a patio like this is permitted and liquor or alcohol of any kind is being served, excise and license has to permit that. We have the Division of Disability Rights, as especially in the right-of-way, patios can present challenges for accessibility or mobility along the sidewalk, and in particular for people who have disabilities. And then one other partner I wanted to mention is Department of Parks and Recreation, particularly the Office of the City Forester, because when we're talking about patios that may be out in areas like are shown in this picture. There's not a tree in this picture, but sometimes there are. And so we have to think about the impacts of patios on our street tree canopy and other landscaping that exists in the right of way. So under that temporary program, by and large, most of the reception of that temporary program or the patios that were permitted under that temporary program have been very positive. Neighbors, businesses, and individuals seem to really see mostly positive benefits to this program. People like to eat outside. People like to hang out outside. It provides a vibrancy to our public realm, even for people that are walking by and kind of experiencing the urban fabric of our city. And so with that positive reception, that's been good and all, but there have certainly been issues. One of the main ones, which I've already kind of mentioned, is accessibility. So I don't like to show bad examples from Denver, not trying to call anybody out, but here's an example in San Diego. I was out there a year or so ago. And this is a point where I'm seeing there's kind of a lot of stuff in the right of way. And you can imagine if I'm a person that's visually impaired and I use a cane to help navigate the public right of way, it's just kind of like meandering and different types of elements being in there might make it challenging for me to find my way through. So that's been a bit of an issue in some cases. Design quality hasn't always been the level that we'd like to see in terms of kind of materials that were put out there that deteriorated over time. It's been difficult to enforce on this temporary program. There have been some safety issues related to visibility at intersections, different things like that. I think there have been a few cases of impacts to like protected zone districts or residential areas where, perhaps like noise or the impacts of the patio itself on a nearby residential property, for example, have been issues in a couple of cases that I'm aware of. And then the review process for people trying to establish a patios, as I mentioned, there's a lot of departments involved, so we know that's been really challenging for businesses. Nevertheless, given the mostly positive reviews of the temporary program, city officials from all these different departments started getting together and talking about the potential to develop a more permanent version of this program. And meanwhile, we saw this happening around the country in cities. They set up temporary programs all around the country during COVID, and many of those cities are now moving to establish more permanent programs based on that experience. Meanwhile, we got a lot of stakeholder interest in a permanent program and expressing a desire to create something like that. And so about a year ago, with all that kind of going on, Mayor Hancock did direct the various city departments involved in this space, if you will, to start work on developing a permanent program. There was some press around that just about a year ago this time. So from that, we are just getting started in many ways with this work. We've been working on it kind of internally and dealing with patios in that temporary program, but in terms of actually establishing the permanent program through what we're going to call the Outdoor Places program, we're pretty early in that process. We do have a website up with a lot of good information there. This is a screenshot from that website. So if you were to Google Denver Outdoor Places program, or I can try to put it in the chat at the end of after I give this presentation, you can go check it out and get information there. You can sign up to get newsletter notifications and all that good stuff. In terms of the scope of this Outdoor Places effort, we want to sit back and really think about patios and their impact on the urban environment and the public realm in a comprehensive way. We want to think about possibilities beyond just dining and food and beverage, as has happened during the pandemic. Like, what is the possibility for a retail space to expand into the public right away, or maybe an art gallery or something like that? We want to look around at what other cities have done in programs like this. We want to make sure we look at both patios on private property, but also in the right of way. And sometimes we have ones that actually split and are half on right of way and half in private property. So we got to deal with those as well. We want to have outreach that's broad, but we also know that this is a really kind of gets technical, and so we want to do a lot of key stakeholder outreach with businesses, with people that like yourselves that are very aware of kind of neighborhood impact issues and things like that. We are looking to have this program enacted by spring 2023, if we can get there, or soon after. And then I mentioned we're kind of focused on one element of it right now, which is above curb patios. So I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. So as we think about all the types of patios that we've seen, some before COVID even, we've seen patios like this in the right of way, for example, or on private property. But during COVID and somewhat before, we saw a kind of a few different types of patios, right? So one is above curb, that's bottom left, that's between the curb along the street and the private property line and fully within the right of way. And then we have a second one, which we call below the curb. So that's also in the right of way, but examples of that on the bottom right are like patios that happen within what used to be an on-street parking space, or in the top left, a full street was closed. So for an example of that, it's like a Larimer Square is right now. The traffic has been taken off completely. And then we have private property. So the orange patio up at the top is a patio that, as shown here, perhaps was occurring in a space that used to be used as off-street parking before the pandemic. So just some pictures of those types of patios. These are above curb in the right of way. They happen perhaps on the tree lawn or on some element of that sidewalk space. Examples of below the curb, both that full street version or examples where just a parking lane was used. And then private property, again, we saw patios happening in parking lots or other unbuilt spaces on private property. And so of those typologies, as we're working on this project now, we're really focused on this above curb typology. So patios in this space, as you see in this picture, and that are fully within the right of way. And the reason to make that a first priority is a couple of reasons. For one, we had a program, which I'll talk about in a little bit, that was in place to allow patios in this space prior to COVID. And so you'll be familiar with those when I show you some pictures of them. And so we had a little bit of a baseline for that type of a patio even before COVID that we could build off of. Secondly, that's a big priority because those are the spaces where I mentioned before, accessibility as it relates to people moving along sidewalks has been a bit of an issue for some of the COVID patios. And so we're focusing on that's another reason for focusing on this above curb type of patio first, is to address that really critical potential accessibility issue first. And so to try to get some of those COVID patios transitioned into a more permanent program first for above curb, and then we'll move on to those other types I mentioned, below curb and private property. So we're doing some outreach around that right now. This is an example of such outreach. And I do think while we're going to address above curb patios first, I think as we continue on after that to look at these other types I've mentioned, I think we'll inevitably come back and probably make some additional tweaks to these above curb regulations that we're developing now. So I talked about that the city had a program prior to COVID, and that was called the Tables, Chairs, and Railings program. This is an example in this photo of a patio that would have been permitted under this program, the pre-COVID. The typical scenario is like this. The patio is right next to the building. It's enclosed fully by a metal railing, usually, like the one you see in this photo. And that program is what gives us kind of a shoving off point for the above curb typology that we're working on now. So we'll look at enhancements essentially to that program in this first phase, and we'll try to inform the enhancements to that program from lessons that we learned in the pandemic and through Peer Cities research, and as we talk to people in the community. So there's some high-level objectives that we've been working on for this above curb patio specifically. One is that we need to ensure that as we want to promote patios, that we continue to make sure that things are safe, that people are aware of vehicular conflicts and other things like that, that first and foremost, the sidewalk space remains its priority in terms of its function within our city is to get people moving through our city, right? Beyond passing by perhaps a private business, but allowed to move very easily and directly along our sidewalks. And that's particularly important for persons with disabilities. We also want to make sure that patios are being additive to the experience within our public realm. So they're enhancing our placemaking efforts. They are creating visual interest and vibrancy to our streets. That through a program like this, we're supporting our businesses and shooting for economic development and looking at opportunities to make patios a more equitable and attainable option for small business. And then finally, making sure we have to do all the other things we have to do within the right of way, making sure that patios aren't disrupting the ability to provide emergency services, aren't creating stormwater flow issues, are ensuring that businesses have enough services in terms of like bathrooms, for example, to actually service additional capacity from a patio, and making sure our street trees are continuing to thrive and develop even more as we go forward. So through a lot of discussion and research and looking around at other cities, we kind of landed on there are really two types of above curb patios. One of them is ones that happen up close to the building. So we call those building frontage. So patios along the kind of edge of the property line. A second is one that might happen in the amenity zone. And so that's separated from the building out a little bit closer to the curb, as you see in these photos on the right. And so before COVID, we didn't allow very many patios to occur out there near the curb, but we were able to, through the COVID program, to see that that actually could be a good option for our businesses and for our urban environment. So starting with this building frontage option though, so there's a few different examples. What you would have seen before COVID, every patio you would have seen in this location would have been fully enclosed by a railing, as you see in this little graphic in the very top. But what we intend to provide paths to in a more permanent set of regulations would be patios that are partially delineated, like you see this one's sort of bookended by planters in the middle, or even an open condition for a small patio that just might have a few tables and chairs out along the building frontage. Then we have amenity zone, and then similar types of levels of delineation in terms of how enclosed it is or how open it might be, and different rules might come into play depending on the degree to which a patio is delineated. On all these drawings, you see this kind of yellow pathway. And so what that's called is the pedestrian access route, or the PAR, to give you another acronym to think about. But that's the area within that above curb space that must remain open for an individual to move along the sidewalk safely and with room for people to pass each other and things like that. So as we look at the actual design standards, we just made them a draft available for public review yesterday. So this is really good timing to have this meeting, and I can share with you guys where that's at if you want to go check it out. But these are some of the topics that would be addressed in those draft patio design standards. So how patio fits in with its neighbors within a block because they're not in isolation, rules for mobility and safety, emergency access, making sure that utilities are easily accessible in case of emergency or for routine maintenance, making sure that patios are accessible to people, not just to get by and around patios, but that patios themselves are designed for people with disabilities to access and experience as well. Rules about the relationship of patios to landscaping and street trees, urban design and placemaking, how a patio is required to be managed by a business owner, and then processes and procedures for dealing with neighborhood impacts and outreach around those issues. So as you look back at the program that I've described that existed before COVID, some of the differences as we see for above curb, again, I'm talking about that are important to highlight is that we've now had a chance to step back and look at, well, what our peer cities are doing, consolidate guidance and regulations related to patios into one cohesive document that several different departments would use, but for a customer or a business owner can find, or neighbor could find all in one place. We want to improve how agencies work together in the review and approval of these types of patios. We want to really focus on and elevate the need for stewardship of the right of way. Again, this is the right of way, right? And so we're talking about private patios in there. So we want to kind of up the level of design and make sure that if we're going to allow a patio out in the public right of way, that it really be additive to the experience, not just for customers, but for everybody that uses the street space. We do want to introduce additional flexibility, as I mentioned, those different types of patios and different levels of delineation to give businesses more options and give more variety out in our public spaces. As I mentioned already, a bigger emphasis, I think, on accessibility, especially for persons with disability. More clarity about how a patio must be managed by a private entity if it's in the right of way. And then a big thing that we're really excited about and going forward is that we are looking to have an individual that would oversee this outdoor places program, and that would be their sole job. They would be the program administrator, and they sort of work with all the different departments and become a single point of contact for the program, and kind of coordinate both externally with neighbors or business owners, but also coordinate and keep everybody on the same page internally in terms of the different departments that work on this stuff for the city. And so just to wrap up here, I mentioned we did draft and put out for public review a set of design standards that's focused on this above curb location. We are asking for comments on that by November 2022, and we're expecting to have the first iteration of those above curb design standards out in hopefully before Thanksgiving, so that then we can start transitioning those COVID patio permit holders that are in that location, that above curb location, into compliance with these permanent standards. And so I think that's kind of the key information for now. I'm sorry that I know that was a lot, so thanks for bearing with me. I'm happy to answer any questions, point you to any material to review, or take any comments on anything that you see. Thank you.
Well, Brad, I have a couple. One question was submitted by Gertie Grant from Wash Park, and she couldn't be here, but she is concerned about RNOs that have existing good neighbors agreements if a business opts in a year or more to move into the shared places program. Will neighborhood organizations be able to extend those good neighbor agreements? That's one question. And then the second one is about the distinction between private property and public property. I noticed in your above the curb presentation, that kind of got blurred. I'm assuming some of it is privately owned that's in front of the store, and I may be wrong. Maybe it's only parking lots that are privately owned. But this seems like if somebody gets the right to have a patio for 10 years out in front of their house in the right of way, is it still really public right of way? Does it become private property? There's a huge benefit financially to people who are able to make additional income in the public right of way. And there's an equity issue, because I hear you saying you're going to have a very strong a stewardship requirement in terms of the appealing nature of it. There's all sorts of issues about who can afford to do that. And I'm hoping that you're discussing that. I also hope you're discussing situations like New York, where this has led to real garbage problems, and there's neighbors above many of these examples you gave. I'm just wondering if all of that is being discussed in the committee. So it's kind of a couple different issues.
Yeah. So let me take them one at a time. So I'll do Gertie's first, and then I'll come back to you. And by the time I get there, you might have to repeat that a little bit, but I think I got it. So good neighbor agreements is an excellent question. I need to study what some of those look like. I need to spend some time maybe looking at some examples of good neighbor agreements that are associated with patios, because I know that's a common practice. Even before COVID, you know, there were those kind of good neighbor agreements, or GNAs, I guess is the shorthand for that, set up. As you probably know, those agreements are between the individual private business owner and the RNO or the neighbors or whoever, and the city is not actually a party to those agreements technically. And so the enforceability of them has nothing, you know, we don't have any ability to enforce on a good neighbor agreement. So the only, again, without having looked at one, I don't know, but like, I think the only thing we might want to look at and make sure of is that if there's a reference in any of those good neighbor agreements to terminology, maybe from the preceding program that was in place prior to COVID, that's been allowing patios in the right of way for decades in Denver, that, you know, that it's clear that if there's a reference to that this program is replacing that program, and so on and so forth. So maybe I need to look at a couple of those. So I appreciate that question. I couldn't hear you. Sorry, you're muted.
If you go for a permit under the future program, I'm assuming there's still a permitting and is there still some kind of fee? When you go for that permit, will that ability, that's the point at which many neighborhoods ask, you know, a liquor license or an extended permit, ask for a good neighbor agreement. Will they still be allowed to, or will they be allowed to extend existing ones? That was her question.
I think they would probably be allowed to extend existing ones. Part of this that we need to figure out eventually is that, because I think what you're talking about is patios that are already permitted, they're out there, permitted under the old program, right? That existed even before COVID. And so we have to figure out like the relationship between this new program and those patios that were permitted under the old program, right? So it's kind of like, to give you a zoning analogy, it's like, you know how we have like non-conforming uses that are allowed to stay out there even though they're not in compliance with the new rules, but if they come in and want to change the permit, then they'd have to come in and meet the zoning. So I think we might look at some kind of approach like that. And so, but there will be a needs and desires hearing associated with any liquor license. That's required. It's gonna happen. It's state law stuff, and there's nothing about this program that would prevent that. And so when those hearings happen, that's usually what leads to the good neighbor agreement. That could still happen under this program for a new patio. And if anything happened to an old patio and they change their permit or something like that, they would be required to do another needs and desires hearing associated with that liquor permit. And if the good neighbor agreement needed to be updated or anything like that, that could happen in the same way it happened previously. So that's that. Right away mixed with private property you ask about. So actually, I think a lot of, so what we're talking about when we say above curb are those patios that are completely within the right of way. And that's not to say that it's a technical definition we came up with to kind of classify types of patios. It's not to say that one that's a little bit in private property doesn't have similar characteristics, because it does, right? But this is just a management technique for us to kind of manage the load of transitioning these COVID permitted patios into a permanent program. And so first we're dealing with those in the right of way, but this, for an example of a patio that, let's say it's half in the right of way and half on private property, but right up against the building like that, Marzik's on 17th is a great example of that. They've got like picnic tables and little seating out there. I think technically it's on private property, but it is in its impact is very similar to an above curb fully in the right of way patio. We're going to have to deal with those in the next step, along with those patios that are below curb and on private property. It's just trying to kind of meter out, if you will, the load of work to transition patios into a permanent program from that COVID program. So we'll get there.
Okay, well, there's a lot more. I guess I'm just having trouble, and I see Miles has his hand up, but with the right of way is public space, and many of those images you showed, even on the side by the curb, didn't look temporary at all. So does it sort of, I don't know, because of use lose its status as right of way? The
No.
business owner getting a permanent?
No. Let me answer to that. So any kind of permit like this for anything that's in the right of way is going to be revocable. So that's Dottie has authority over the right of way as authorized by everything from the charter to the Denver revised municipal code on down to our local, not local, but our sort of rules and regulations and stuff like that, right? And so if Dottie or other departments come together and decide that a patio is a problem or something like that, and there's a need to revoke it, that can certainly happen. There's no permanent entitlement for anybody to use right-of-way space for a patio. They could be removed even for an emergency. Like, so let's say a main breaks or something like that. Like, we got to get it out of there because we got to deal with the flooding issue or so on. And so the short answer is no, but I just want to give a little bit more background to the.
Okay, I'm going to let some other people go, but I do have a ton of things going on in my head about equity and affordability for these changes, but let's go to Miles.
Yeah, thank you, Brad, again. Great idea, but it raises some questions. So quickly, again, we get back to the public-private. So it sounds like the spaces will be permitted and it can be revocable. So if you're doing a seating area out, let's say below the curb, like you've been showing, and the public wants to sit down there, they put benches or tables there. I guess the permit person can say, get off of the bench because this is private, we're permitted to use this, or used by somebody, I don't know, wanting to camp on it. So how will you deal with that? Will the police remove them?
That's a good question. I think it would act just like it does now. So can you guys still see my screen right now?
Yes.
Are you? Okay, good. So just want to use a visual example to try to respond to that. So this is an example right here of a patio that's in the right of way, but that is permitted under that tables, chairs, and railings program that has existed for multiple decades, I believe. And so that patio is being used by a private property owner. And again, we're just dealing with above the curb. I don't know if you meant to say that. I think you said below the curb. So again, we're just talking about up here above the curb. And so I think if it's a restaurant doing this, what they're going to want to do is have tables out there. I don't think it's going to be benches. And so, yeah, they would be permitted to use that space. And I guess in theory, they could potentially ask somebody to leave, just like it would be done, I would imagine, for a space like this. There are a lot of private things that happen in the right of way. A patio is one example. I'm going to look into that, though. I want to be able to give you a better answer on that. So maybe I'll reach out to the police department or others just to kind of get a sense of the history of that, because I'm sure that happened on patios just like this, right? That have been around for many, many years. So
right, but that's a fenced off area, so it's quite clear. You were also just showing umbrellas and tables out on the sidewalk. So I think it becomes a question of, can they forcibly remove people? If I'm tired and I'm a tourist and I want to sit down,
Yeah.
And then the next question too is looking at those umbrellas, and I've got a specific question on Colfax, but are there height requirements? Because if I'm on a scooter or something, and do you see how that umbrella is hanging out over the sidewalk? And it could be an
Yes.
impediment to somebody, or somebody could walk into it. Do you monitor that, or if they want to build a structure that will allow them to build an arbor or something like that?
Yeah, so lots of good questions. So on just real quick, so how we've got it drafted, and we'll see what happens. It's just a draft right now. But what we've said is that when you have loose furniture like this, like if it's not enclosed, or even if it's just partially enclosed, so essentially anything that's not like fully enclosed by a railing, like the picture we were looking at a moment ago, what we're saying is that when the business is not operating, that like, so when the business closes at night, that they need to pick up this furniture and take it inside. Because it could get picked up and thrown around, it could get moved into the right of way, and there's no one there to manage it, and now it's in the way of somebody who's trying to walk down a sidewalk and stuff like that, right? One potential exemption to that would be for a heavier, like a picnic table or something, right? That is less likely to just get easily moved into that sidewalk space. And what we said in the draft is that you have, if you are allowed to keep that free floating furniture, so example, a picnic table out there beyond closing hours, that when it's out there and the business is closed, that it should be allowed to be used by anybody who might be walking by.
Okay. And then
And on the structure, you ask about a structure too. Well, first you ask about these umbrellas. Yes, I don't think this one's going to meet the rules because this is a COVID one, right? So they're not being, we're giving some grace with this temporary program, but no, what we're saying is the lowest part of that umbrella would have to be 8 feet above the right-of-way surface, and that umbrella would have to be fully contained within the patio area, so that you can't have a umbrella like kind of at the edge of the patio and the pole is within the patio, but that the canopy of the umbrella is like sticking out over the required pedestrian access route would not be allowed.
so no overhangs. Okay, I like that. What about electrical? Like I know there's one shop that put lights out over the sidewalk. So now you've got electrical lines out over the public right of way. Is that allowed?
No. In the draft, we have said no. We're concerned about overhead wires that would cross, again, that pedestrian access route. And whether they're crossing overhead, or sometimes we've seen during the pandemic, right? We've seen electrical power coming across and actually be at grade, meaning there's like there's either just a wire crossing the pedestrian access route, or sometimes they do a little better job and they put like a little contraption over it that is bigger, that allows a wheelchair or something, to move over it. But in these new regulations, what we're saying for now in the draft is that either overhead or at grade would not be allowed to cross that pedestrian access route. So what you'd have to go back to, right, is like some more serious permit than this, which would allow you to perhaps like go underneath the sidewalk, right? If you were trying to, because usually when we see that, right, you're trying to extend a wire out to something that's closer to the curb. So you might have to go underneath or something.
Okay. And then is there any size limitation? So let's say I've got a small restaurant with a parking lot on the side. Can I just close the whole parking lot and put tables out there? And now you've changed the parking requirements for the zoning. Basically, there's no parking requirements for
I don't know yet. We haven't gotten to the discussion on the private property ones yet. And so that just remains to be seen. The COVID program did allow, of course, it's an emergency program, so we can look at it, but it was a temporary program, right? That program did allow you to put patios in the place of any parking off street, including parking required by the zoning code for this temporary program. I don't know where that will go, but we'll see. But just no decision on that yet, or how it relates to zoning requirements for off-street parking.
Because what that tells me is then there should be a requirement of staffing level per the amount of square footage that you have, that it would be required. There needs to be some control, that's all, for the property owner to just say, I want 10,000 square feet of patio. So then my next question too is, and this is more of an existing condition on Colfax, like by the Atomic Pizza, they've got the hard railing, which is understandable. It's nice, but they have planter boxes hanging out. They've got lighting, they've got street trees, and they're putting BRT in at some point in the future. And I don't think there's enough space for somebody even pushing a scooter or somebody in a wheelchair, somebody with a dog, to try to get by areas like that. So how will you deal with those kind of narrow right-of-ways on these really heavily used areas?
So couple of things. So that, like I said in the beginning, is basically the number one priority, at least above the grid. There's a lot of stuff going on below the street, right? That's of massive importance, infrastructure down there, but at least we're above the ground. The most important priority of these spaces, and that will remain so, is that people need to be able to walk along the sidewalks or move in a wheelchair or however you get around, right, at legally on a sidewalk space. And so that's number one. I'm not familiar with the exact location you're talking about, but I made a note, and so I'll try to check it out, the Atomic Pizza. But so here's the baseline, and this is the baseline. Back before COVID, with that tables, chairs, and railings program, used to be that you must maintain a 5-foot wide pedestrian access route. I think in our peer cities research, what we're seeing is that the best practice is starting to move towards 6
Exactly.
minimum, 6 foot minimum. And so we are actually making that change. We're proposing to make that change, and that's what it shows in the draft. It says 6 foot minimum. So that's a foot more than was allowed before as a baseline. We did provide a little bit of flexibility, like in a really constrained condition. And if it was on like a smaller street that maybe had a low pedestrian activity levels, that maybe 5 foot could be okay, but that would be a special case-by-case consideration. So the baseline is 6, but we also have the situations where we would require more than 6. So those relate to the kind of functionality of the road, like how much traffic it's carrying, the degree of pedestrian level activities, how much space there even is between the private property line and the curb, where we could get up to a level of even requiring up to 8 foot, or maybe even more on a case-by-case basis. And again, with it being in the right-of-way, we have that opportunity to give ourselves a little bit of flexibility to make sure we're doing the right thing around mobility and being responsive to context, right? Because you make this point about Atomic Pizza, but what we found is that with these patios, man, it's just a very case-by-case situation. Every street is different, even every part of a block or one side of the block versus another. It's a different thing you're dealing with. And so we want to create rules that set a minimum bar, but we also want to make sure we give ourselves enough flexibility in the rules to require more in cases where the context calls for it, or maybe in some cases require less if it's a really constrained condition.
Yeah, as long as it's revocable. And then let me just ask this final question. Thank you again for answering all the questions. So there's this new, I think, rule where you can do an open carry if you combine properties or something between liquor things. So if I have lots, can a whole block become a free walking liquor thing if everyone connects and there's seating everywhere? And would that be allowed?
Theoretically, it would be. That would require many permits and approvals above and beyond what this program can handle. So this program could be used to, let's say a group of businesses came in and wanted to apply from that. Just for disclaimer, there are none of those types of districts in Denver yet. There are some in in neighboring cities, but we don't have one yet. What it's called is a common consumption area.
Right.
That's the technical name for it. And so those require city council approval and all kinds of specialized approvals as enabled by state legislation. And so this program is really focused on kind of individual patios and small spaces like you see in a lot of the pictures I've shown. So I think there's a relationship between the two, but just, I guess my answer for now would be this program could not permit something like this, but this program could address patio design. And then from there, in theory, yes, a group of businesses could come together and try to make that happen. But it's a pretty rigorous undertaking to do so, which is why we haven't seen one yet in Denver.
All right, thank you.
So I just want to add to that, the common consumption areas, it's square footage that determines whether businesses can come together, and hopefully they wouldn't be able to use the right of way that they're borrowing for square footage. But I'd like you to answer, I'm going to have Ian conclude because we want to leave a little bit of time to just come back to ADUs, but could you just answer Alan Gass's question? Does a restaurant pay rent for the facilities they're putting in the right of way?
They pay so this is what they do right now under the old program. They pay a application fee, and then they pay an annual fee, which that the permit to occupy the right of way gets renewed once a year. And so they pay that fee year in, year out, each year. And, you know, if they were to make changes or want to update the patio or something like that, they might have to come in and do another application, at which point they'd have to pay another application fee. So that's how it works now. We are still in the process of determining what the fees should be. The fees that are for the old program are pretty old, and I don't think have been revisited for many, many years. And so we're trying to, we don't want to rush into that. We need to figure it out pretty soon, especially for above curb, because we're going to start having these businesses have to come into a permanent, to come into compliance with these rules. And so we can't take forever on it. So it's a priority, but we're just not there yet. And we want to be really careful with how that fee's set. And that has to take into consideration all kinds of things. You know, what are the other uses that and amenities that are demanded from the right of way? What is the benefit to the business owner in terms of revenue, and how are we capturing back on that? On the other end of things, like while it's more capacity for perhaps for business, it does provide an amenity for users, I think, of the spaces themselves, but also the right of way. These are, you know, when you think of if you've ever had the opportunity to go to a lot of other countries, whether it's Europe or Mexico or different places like that, this kind of seating that's really making for a very vibrant street space is super common, and people really like it. But you know, so there's a benefit, I think, and I think most people think, so far I've heard, to the experience of the city. And so we take that into account and all these other factors I mentioned in the development of a fee, an application fee, but also that kind of annual fee I talked about.
Thank you. And Ian, do you want to ask the last question? Or
Yeah, I have a couple things. Maybe I'll send an email because I want to be respectful of everyone else's time. But looking at this public comment of 2 weeks, it just feels like not best practices to only allow the community to respond in 2 weeks. You know, we've asked for extensions on things in the past. I feel like it was released yesterday. You're here, which is great, but most RNOs, most neighborhoods that are tracking excise and license issues meet monthly, and a 2-week comment period just seems rather short. That's more of a comment in regard to what we're getting in exchange. And when we talk about equity, it seems to me like the community has been consistently asking for public restroom access. And it seems to me like if you're getting access to the right of way, this could be a solid solution for expanding the public restroom network in return for a good that they're getting from the community. I think I may write in some comments related to that, because, you know, a nominal fee is great. And honestly, you know, with rising rents and small, like legacy businesses, like this seems like an opportunity for them to generate revenue, and I can appreciate that. And so it just seems like we could have a win-win there. I am a little concerned about street trees and like the implications and like on the roots and stuff. And maybe that's already part of the conversation. I also am kind of concerned about what happens if they want to come and put all this like outdoor heating lamps and stuff. I know in Aspen, for example, businesses that choose to do that because of the climate impact, like they pay a fee that goes back to like funding low income electrification, just as an example, because they're just out there burning gas, they're burning electricity to heat a space outdoors in the winter. And like I guess I don't want to see more of that working against ourselves from like a climate perspective. So I'm gonna write up all these in comments. And like the last one I have to say is like, like I said, I'm in favor of this, I believe. But when we're talking about safety of right of way and the complete discrepancy between the fencing, the rocks, the orange fencing that is being put up in the right of way and allowed by the city, at the same time as allowing these businesses to profit, there's certainly inequity there. And it's also dangerous. If you go to Capitol Hill, there are people who literally can't exit cars without stepping into the street, and it works against their Vision Zero. And so like it just seems really duplicative of the city to say they want to prioritize safety of right of way and at the same time like allowing all of this to continue in the central core.
Lots of amazing comments and questions there. And I think like very well demonstrates something that in some people's minds, well, it's just like a simple patio. All the variety of comments you just provided show how complex that stuff can get really quickly and all the different considerations. Just a couple of things. So forestry is a team that we're working with very closely on this. And when you look at the draft, I hope if you're able to, that'll be awesome. And you'll see in there a whole section on street trees and landscaping and a process set up to mitigate the potential impacts that you're talking about. Everything from a patio like interfering with the growth of a branch, to a patio resulting in a bunch of people walking around near the roots of a tree that can cause problems. Love the comment about the sustainability question related to heaters. That's a good point that I think we need to talk about and think about. I hadn't heard of the Aspen precedent, so I'll go check that out and see what they wrote up in their regs, see if that might be a model for us for sure. When you talk about safety, just real quick, are you saying like if there was like a physical railing or something and then somebody opens their door, they can't get out on that side because they have to open their door into like a railing?
Yeah, exactly. And again, I know it's not part of this regulation, but since you work with CBD and you're having these right-of-way conversations, the rocks that they've dumped on 22nd, 21st, the fencing along Grant, Pearl, Pennsylvania, I mean, you name it, in these highly dense areas where walkability is like probably the highest of anywhere in the city and county of Denver, is really concerning to me, because people roll up and there's somehow these right-of-way blockages are being allowed. And I know they're anti-homeless. I know that we're struggling with homeless issues. I serve them every Sunday. And what I can tell you is people slash the fences and then they tie their tents to now poles or rocks that actually make them more sturdy than they were to begin with. But it's growing. We're seeing entire sidewalks closed off for blocks, which we pushed back on with construction projects and requiring permitting of open sidewalks, but we're continuing to see this. And so, I understand it's not in the scope of this, but I just, there is this, I brought this up, actually, I was in a 303 article about this in the middle of the pandemic, about this inequity that was existing where we were trying to help some people struggling, at the same time, the people who are struggling the most, we were actually being punitive to. And so I just wanted to raise that to you. I think my biggest overall question, and I'm going to write all these in comments, is just, can we get a longer public comment period? Because 2 weeks just really feels not best practices by any standard.
Yeah, no, I hear you. You may still feel the same way when I'm finished saying this, and that's fine. And I appreciate what you're saying there. I will say that what the focus right now is on is we have about 30 above curb, as I defined it earlier, temporary patio permit holders, like under that COVID program. And so what we want to do with this first set of standards is start the transition into something with more robust requirements for accessibility and get them out of that kind of Wild West situation that they're in. And so some of that gives me heartburn too. And what, I guess, just to say that, like, I think we don't have to finish this conversation, you know, with this first iteration. I think we'll keep talking about this, and that this first iteration is probably going to be mostly applicable to people that are in those 30 patios. So we have lots of more time to have a citywide conversation, but still 2 weeks still is not ideal. I agree, but I'll take that comment back to our leadership.
If it is about 30 locations, then, you know, I think my expectation would be that you would connect directly with the RNOs that are in that community. I know that CPD has the power to mail to individuals that surround certain addresses for rezoning. I think there is enough time in this 2-week window to not just put up our hands and say we could have done more, because I know how it is working in the government. Once you set one set of regulations, to go back and undo things is much more of a challenge from a community perspective than it is to bake the rules in the first time.
So just one thing, I hear you saying this is a draft. Is it going to planning board after 2 weeks, this part of the regulations? Where's it going?
No, this is a right of way only. Remember, we're talking about, so planning board doesn't have purview over rules and regulations for the right of way. This is something that Dottie and other departments are able to adopt as rules and regulations, similar to like how we do with the design guidelines document. It's regulatory in nature, but it doesn't actually have to go to city council for approval as a zoning amendment would.
But after 2 weeks, it will become regulation.
After 2 weeks, the comment period is over, and then we got to do another draft. The final draft is how it's set out now. You know, things change or whatever, and so I'll take Ian's comment for sure back to our team. But that's how we're contemplating that happening, right? You know, as I sit here today.
Well, thank you for this presentation. It was well done and answered a lot of questions and raised a lot of questions. And I really appreciate you coming, and hopefully you and Jay from Dottie will be able to come back maybe in January and tell us.
Well, I'll check with him. I know we'll come back. Whether we'll be in January, I don't want to commit to that now, but certainly we'll come back, and we see this group as a great resource, as evidenced by this conversation. So we appreciate your having us, and as we go forward beyond this moment of above curb and continue to tackle this project over the next 9 months, we hope that you'll be engaged and help us spread the word and all that other stuff. So just appreciate y'all.
Okay, well, thank you. And I would like to keep people here for another 15 minutes to discuss the ADU question that we talked about with Barge last week. So please don't leave. This is important. As you remember, Robert from Brunn had brought up a couple of issues. One, probably the most important, was regarding the possibility that CPD is going to suggest an owner does not need to live on either the main property or in the ADU. I would like to get an update from Robert. And Robert, would you like to give us a brief summary of what your RNO is considering here?
Yes, I'm Robert Schmidt. I'm a representative of Berkeley Regis United Neighbors on their zoning and planning committee. And what has transpired since the last INC ZAP meeting is, in the short of it, is that the assessment report has been converted into a motion that will be discussed in detail at the next Brunn ZAP meeting in November. And the outcome of that will then be forwarded to the Brunn board for consideration and possible action. In the discussions that were not in detail in the September meeting, October meeting, sorry about that. The point that Christine brought up, had a lot of discussion on was the change in the owner occupancy rule. Another change from the assessment report is that infrastructure, based on information that came in from Denver Water and Doty, is that infrastructure was kind of moved out from being an issue of concern or a problem. They feel that there is, based on historic number of ADUs being developed over time, that they have sufficient capacity in water and sewer to handle any additional ADUs in the various neighborhoods in town. Let's see, the bulk plane change got a little bit of discussion. I think that it's interesting in comparison to today's discussion over in Sunnyside about bringing down the bulk plane here, where the discussion in ADUs is increasing the dimension of the bulk plane. Just an observation from today. Square footage allotment of ADUs, particularly on small lots. At the larger citizens advisory group level, there's been a lot of discussion about increasing the minimum square footage required from 650 to possibly up to 1,000 square feet. I think that Amanda talks about this, and depending on the lot size and the size of the primary structure, we have to look at this very carefully and can't get away from the point that this is an accessory structure to a primary structure. So we have to watch that the accessory structure could become oversized, let's say, on the lot. So our recommendation is that there needs to be some study and some work based on the different sizes of lots in the different neighborhoods about how a minimum square footage could be applied there. Those were the ones that got the most discussion in the point in time. There's been some, as time has gone on, there's been some revising of the text from the assessment report to the motion that has gone forward, and that's been distributed. And there's I think that's going to be the sole topic of our November meeting. We're anticipating a lot of discussion.
So I'd like to see if there's some questions, but I just have one, Robert. What has happened in the focus group meeting since we met with Barge? Has there been any changes from what he presented?
No, there's nothing that's come out. What has, because Abe was at our zoning and planning meeting, and because I did send the assessment report to CPD, so I don't know if that had any direct impact or not, but they are taking a slight pause. They did cancel their November meeting of the advisory group, where they're taking in a number of comments that they've gotten and see how they can look at those and assess those comments with regards to where they ended up at the end of meeting 6, which was in September. I guess it's the October meeting that's not going to take place. Sorry. But nothing else new has been issued. They're gonna be doing some analysis and then come back, and there will be some further discussion at the advisory group level. I'm assuming at the November meeting.
Are you in a focus group with them to share?
No, I am not. No. I applied, I was not accepted. There's another member of our zoning and planning committee who applied himself, and he's on the advisory group.
So are you suggesting anything for ZAP members? I mean, I'm mostly concerned about the owner occupancy that rule that they're considering removing that, and an owner can build an ADU, then move off the property and live in neither. Has that been changed?
From the city's perspective,
Yes.
no, there hasn't been any official revision to recommendations or anything like that since meeting 6 in September. So it's what was basically in the assessment report and what is being covered in our draft motion is where their current position is, which is not really finalized, but it is a strong consideration. And the city states a number of reasons why they're at that time in September, they're recommending that that rule, which is in Article 11 of the zoning code, probably would be deleted. I don't know. Revising the language, I don't know what you would revise the language to. So it'd be a situation where you would be you'd be deleting the language. And that particular item was strongly discussed at our meeting. There's a lot of people who feel strongly that it needs to remain in place, and there are some that strongly believe that it should be done away with. I did stumble on, I forgot I had it. That was in my archive file, an email string exchange that was with Naomi at Council District 1, and their position was, and they agreed that because I think that Amanda alluded to some of the reasons about being able to have the existing residents of a property be able to stay there, and as a wealth building tool for a lot of people, that the owner occupancy rule should remain. And I think she alluded to that in her talking today.
Well, thank you for this. Miles, do you have something to add?
Yeah, just a quick question for Robert, because you're the architect. Could somebody redevelop a property and basically build a duplex under the new rule? If you were to enlarge the ADU, you could build basically 2 units at the same time.
That particularly has not been discussed. That someone could take the structure and divide it into, let's call it 2 occupancies. That has not been discussed. There's always been the premise that one will, for the sake of this discussion, we'll call him the tenant, that one tenant would occupy the one accessory building.
Okay, because it almost seems like you could actually, with a bigger lot, basically build 2 houses on it and redesign the whole lot so that it looks like a townhouse or something like that.
You taking into account the lot sizes in the suburban context, you probably could do that in a number of them, because the lot size is big enough. You get up to something that's 12,000 square feet or above. In that, I think that in the 6,250, the 7,000, and the 5,000 square foot lot sizes, I think it would be butting up against other goals of the program, livability and size, because there's some people that want to eliminate the overcrowding rule, which is also in Article 11, and I think that would go against that because your accessory building would be too small. The reason for increasing, and the way that they looked at it, the advisory group looked at it, was to be able to handle the possibility of, say, the husband, wife, son-in-law, daughter of a family somehow needs economic support and they move into an ADU temporarily or whatever, with 1 or 2 children, to be able to have a larger, I don't know which way, larger family group, be able to live. Because most of the ADUs are like, they're 1-bedroom structures.
Right, and that was the design. They're supposed to be accessory, not
Yes.
primary.
Yes, and that, when those kind of statements start getting made, then, then the opposite side of the table comes along and says, well, wait a minute. This sounds like we're wanting to develop a whole other primary structure.
Correct.
To look at it from a code point of view, if the owner occupancy rule was removed, it would, in a sense, be creating a quasi TU context embedded in an SU neighborhood.
Yes.
And somebody stated, okay, so if you want to do this, and the property owner is living off site, thereby creating a micro multifamily
Yes.
scenario, then the owner of the property should be forced to apply for a zoning change to actually codify the property as a TU zoned lot. Now that's going to run into all kinds of problems, because one of the original goals of the 2010 code was to eliminate spot zoning through the city.
Right.
So this has to have this whole program has to have a lot of thought, because the domino effect and the unintended consequences, there's a lot of that exists in here. It's like moving around the piece of mercury. You bump it one place and it's going to bump out someplace else.
Right.
And we certainly learned, or should have learned, our lessons when it came along to discovering what impact in our neighborhoods the slot home building form was going to have. Totally unanticipated in 2000.
I may question that, because I think if the city's goal, or CPD's goal, is to increase densities, I would say based on that was very successful. A minor change allowed all of these units to be built across the city and the west side to be redeveloped at a phenomenal rate. I would almost say for CPD, that was a moonshot. And I'm just wondering, are they looking for another way, again, to create duplexes where there's single family homes? That's all.
Well, this gets into points of discussing what is compatible for the existing neighborhood context and things like that. You can drive around town in the close-in surrounding neighborhoods that were developed from the 20s on out through the 80s. And there are numerous embedded, depending on the lot size, 2 and 3 unit buildings that are not 2-story, they're single story. There are several of them in our neighborhood around the Tennyson business district. It all boils down to what goes along with your statement, Miles, is how is the look of whatever's being built out there being influenced by design? Okay.
Yeah.
The technical aspect of doing slot homes, the ability to put 6 units in what was a standard 7,500 SU lot, yes, that solved that problem. But the way that they were designed, based on the general building form, was atrocious. And I have found very few architects outside of the realm of the architects who design these structures who think that there's any architectural worthwhile value to these buildings being embedded in the neighborhood. They kind of turn a cold shoulder to the street. All of the aspects that were brought up in Amanda's overlay for eyes on the street and front porch were totally ignored because of the loopholes in the general building form portion of the code that allowed slot homes to be developed in an MX zone district. That aspect of it has been addressed so that those design negatives aren't happening anymore.
So, Robert and Miles, we are really at time and need to wrap up, but I guess, Robert, are you ready or interested in making a ZAP motion, or you want to come back? I mean,
I think that there needs to be a little bit more discussion within the ZAP committee. I don't have any sense of any type of consensus from people, whether or not they read through the document and what they are in alignment with or not in alignment with. I put up in the chat, if anybody wants a copy of the motion that is being discussed by Brun, they can email me and I'll forward a PDF of the motion and they can take a look at it. This is, I see it, some people don't, but I see this as an objective review of what's happened in the first 6 meetings, because a good part of this is generally in agreement with what is being proposed by the advisory group and CPD. It just needs to be tweaked a little bit. So, I mean, I could redo the header of the letter and forward another PDF to you that it be a motion to be considered by INC ZAP. I don't think that nothing to go through and rewriting. I mean, I think that my perspective is, I think you need to take a holistic look at everything that's being provided, because the devil is in the details.
well, do you think we should ask Abe to come back to address 2 or 3 things only?
I would want to see where they come out on the November meeting from assessing all the comments from the in-person meeting and from the online comments thing. That they had some that they brought out, but there hasn't been any changing to what is on the table right now based on comments that have been submitted. I mean, they recognize that there were comments, and they made reference to several of them in the meeting 6 PowerPoint, but they haven't come to the next step, whether this is a valid comment that needs to be interjected into the process, or whether it's something that we're not going to consider. That's what supposedly they're working on now.
Okay, well then I guess we'll wrap up. I'm in an area that isn't really addressing this because there's really no room for ADUs. So I wonder how many neighborhoods are sharing concerns that Berkeley Regis is sharing.
I had 3 emails from the last meeting that asked for a copy of the assessment report.
Okay. All right, well, Ian, do you have any other before we wrap up?
I just want to make a zoning announcement, just so people are aware that the Park Hill Golf Course zoning change and small area map amendment did move through the planning board last week after 6 or 7 hours of work on it and or of debate and public testimony. So, I know a lot of people have strong feelings both ways, and just be aware that the process is moving. And is expected to go to council for discussion and then a vote, of course, at council. And then if it were to move forward, a vote to the people in April.
Okay, and I just heard that the City Advancing Equity in Rezoning Committee they were supposed to be here today. Then I had them for November. They're not ready to come. There's been a change in the leadership on that. So at this point, we don't have them for November. I don't know what to say. I think we better not get into the Park Hill Golf Course thing. So All right, well, thank you, Robert, for your time on this. I'm not in a position to lead anything on this. That's what I'm basically saying. Drew, did you want to say something else? I see you came back on.
No, I'm sorry if you, I'm sorry, I'm multitasking here, but this is a great discussion. Thank you, Robert and Miles and everybody. And thank you, Christine and Ian. It really makes me realize how vital this ZAP committee is. What a great discussion, you know. So that's all.
Okay, so hopefully we'll have an agenda for the Saturday before Thanksgiving. That's November 19th. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.